everybody. Here to introduce our next speaker is Bill Bissett. He's the president of the Kentucky Coal Association, which is this session's sponsor. Bill was previously employed as the Chief of Staff and Senior Vice President for Communications of Marshall University in West Virginia. Prior to working for his alma mater, Bissett served as Vice President of Public Relations for Charles Ryan Associates. During his tenure at CRA, he was instrumental in the establishment of the Friends of Coal campaign. Please join me in welcoming a great friend of the Kentucky Chamber, Bill Bissett.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I appreciate it a great deal. And David, please know we appreciate the collaborative relationship that the coal industry and Kentucky Coal Association has with the Chamber and all of its members. We try at the Kentucky Coal Association to be an information source. We answer questions about the industry, where it's going, where it's been. And as you heard from Governor Beshear and Congressman Rogers previously, yesterday, our industry is facing tremendous challenges right now. We're seeing some growth in our Western Kentucky coal field, but we're seeing perilous times in our Eastern Kentucky coal field. We have lost, since January 1, 2012, more than 7,000 direct coal mining jobs in Eastern Kentucky. And for every one coal mining job lost, we lose at least 3 other Kentucky jobs indirectly, 3 other livelihoods because of what happens in the coal industry indirectly, and beyond that, induced jobs, the gas stations, the hotels, the restaurants, all the other people affected, not just in Eastern Kentucky, but also in Lexington and Louisville, where a lot of our associate members are located. So I appreciate the Chamber's interest and your interest in the coal industry. We're going to hear from a speaker who expands that Kentucky perspective, which I would say he knows very well in addition to, but also give more of a national and international view on what's going on in the industry. And I just wanted to ask quickly, who here knows Mike Duncan? Okay, I figured a bunch of people do, and sure enough, I'm right. I've known Mike since he was put in the position as leading ACE, the American Coalition for Clean Coal Energy. He does a magnificent job in this role, and I think he makes Kentucky proud. I know he makes those of us in the coal industry very proud, and he provides, I think, a reasoned voice in a place where there's a great deal of acrimony in Washington, and we need that voice. We need more voices in Washington speaking up for Kentucky, speaking up for coal, and Mike does that very, very well. We work with a lot of lawyers in the coal industry, and many of you are in the room who are of the legal profession who help us with the challenges that coal faces. And we appreciate that legal work. We depend on you to protect our industry, our workers, our miners, and keep things running, keep coal running. And you do a great job at that. But the answers I hear time and time again are not just legal, even from the lawyers we work with. The answers are now political. The answers are social and involve communication and an industry speaking for itself in a clear, unified voice. And that's what Mike Duncan does. We appreciate our relationship with ACE, Mike. We appreciate the collaborative nature as we face these challenges, specifically the greenhouse gas hearings that happen next week in Atlanta, Pittsburgh, Denver, and Washington. You'll be hearing more about that next week. But most of all, it's trying to work together for those coal mining and coal-using states like Kentucky that protects our economy, that protects our low-cost electricity, and protects our way of life. Without further ado, I'll introduce Mike Duncan.
Bill, thank you. I appreciate that introduction. It reminded me of what Congressman Rogers said yesterday. I thought your next line was, well, so many of you know him, the less said, the better. So I was waiting for that. It didn't quite get there. Well, thank you for having me today. And Elizabeth, let me thank you for your leadership and what you've done with the Chamber and Jim Booth last year. And I was involved with the Chamber early in my career in Kentucky, and I can tell you the Chamber has never been better than under the leadership of Dave Atkinson. Dave, congratulations. Well, this morning I'm going to talk to you about coal. I want to talk a little bit about the history, the importance of coal in Kentucky and nationally and internationally. Talk a little bit about what's going on in Washington with what we believe is a regulatory assault, what we can do about it here in Kentucky, and then speculate on the future of Kentucky. It's really an honor for me to be here today and get a chance to talk to you all about the future of Kentucky's coal economy. I happened to notice that Dave scheduled me at a very interesting time because Bill Samuel's son Rob is next in the program, and I must admit that when I was looking at that, I thought probably Dave and some of the organizers think that you may need a stiff drink after you hear about the future of coal in Kentucky. But I'm here to tell you that that's not true. While we're facing a lot of challenges in the coal industry, in Kentucky in particular, I believe that there's still a strong future, and that the future, more importantly, is still in our hands. I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of coal because I think it's important to give a context. Some of you know a lot about it. Many of you know a lot. Jim Booth, Alliance Coal, Joe Kraft. Many of you in the room know a lot more about coal than I do. So I want to talk a little bit about the history so that you get a flavor of where we've been, not only in Kentucky but in the world. The ancient Chinese and the Romans used coal. Coal really came into being in the 18th and 19th century when we were using it to produce stronger forms of iron and steel. It became a power source for steam engines and locomotives. It's what powered the Industrial Revolution that's led us where we are today. It led Europe out of the caste system toward capitalism, and it helped create a stronger middle class, not only in this country but in parts of the world. After the Civil War, Americans began to embrace coal-powered machines, and by the 1890s, the coal industry stretched from the Appalachians across the Midwest to the Rockies, and the U.S. became the largest producer of coal in the world. Here in Kentucky, we have a rich history. Anybody from Muhlenberg County here today? Muhlenberg County had the first commercial mine that was opened in 1820. In the 80 years that followed that, virtually all of Kentucky's coal was mined in the western part of Kentucky. In 1900, the first commercial mine opened in eastern Kentucky in Floyd County. And for the next 90 years, coal grew steadily. In 1990, we see the trend reverse for a number of reasons. The Clean Air Act, many older, less efficient plants were shut down and more efficient plants were opened. But while production decreased, coal remained the dominant force and source for electricity. We've seen over the arc of history that mankind is using greater amounts of coal, particularly as societies have become industrialized. Truly, coal has powered our civilization. Now, coal, as many of our speakers have alluded to previously, is very important in Kentucky. Kentucky gets 92% of its electricity from coal. As a result, we have some of the lowest electric prices in the country. Some believe we have the second lowest electric prices in the nation. We're 25% below the national average in what we pay per kilowatt hour. This gives Kentucky a huge advantage. It makes us more competitive. Our friends here at the Chamber can tell you about the cost of doing business and how important that is in recruiting new business to Kentucky, particularly manufacturing business, because it's such a high percentage of what manufacturers use to make their products. Roughly 17% of Kentucky's gross output comes from manufacturing, and about 12% of our employees in the state are working in manufacturing. Our low cost of electricity makes these companies more competitive. A second important reason in Kentucky is the low-cost electricity helps Kentucky families. I want to talk a little bit about something you may not think about intuitively, but coal helps the most vulnerable citizens in our state. This is often overlooked, but the less income a family makes, the higher percentage that a family spends on energy. Here in Kentucky, households that make above $50,000 spend about 9% of their after-tax income on energy. 9%. Compare that with families that make under $10,000, and you say, oh, we don't have a lot of those. We have over 180,000 of those families in Kentucky. Those families spend 70% of their after-tax disposable income on energy. So when electricity rates go up, it's the poor who suffer the most, not only in Kentucky, but all over the country. The fact is that the use of coal has brought significant societal benefits: electrification, jobs, wages, a growing tax base, better health care, lower cost, and I could go on and on. It's a base of our civilization. Throughout human history, the use of coal has coincided with the growth and prosperity. Yet over the last 5 years, we've seen a shift in the approach to coal. While coal is still the dominant source of electricity, its popularity certainly has declined during that period of time. Now, some of this is due to the economy. The terrible recession and long recovery decreased demand for energy and for coal. Some of this is due to the declining price of natural gas. New drilling techniques have opened up access to shale gas, driving up volumes of natural gas and decreasing prices, even though we saw some comeback in that last year, a substantial amount at one point last year. But most of the problem has to do with the regulatory assault that coal has been under for the past 5 years. You heard the governor and Congressman Rogers allude to that yesterday. If you're in eastern Kentucky, you feel like you have been under assault for the past several years. If you can name it, EPA has begun regulating it. Ozone standards, regional haze regulations, mercury standards, particulate matter regulations, and the list goes on, and each one of these carries a steep price tag, and you know it in your business. You're facing the same thing in many of your businesses. A study that we commissioned by the National Economic Research Associates, or NERA, found that just 7 of the regulations would cost the electric sector about $200 billion a year. In addition, these regulations would be responsible for the shutdown of coal-fired plants that supply between 54,000 and 69,000 megawatts. That's huge. That's a big percentage in our country. 54 and 69,000 megawatts of power. This would also cost the country over 500,000 jobs a year. Now, economic models are not perfect, so the range is somewhere between 500,000 and 887,000 jobs a year under the 7 regulations that have already been put out there and that are in place. This excludes what the EPA is talking about with their latest proposal for carbon emissions. Huge economic impacts. And what's most frustrating about that for me, particularly someone from eastern Kentucky who sees on a daily basis what this is doing to people, but I have the chance to see it nationally now, what is so frustrating about this is that it's often a solution in search of a problem. Over the past 40 years, major emissions from coal plants have declined by 90% in this country. I'm young enough, old enough, young enough, I'm not in the cohort, I'm out of the cohort, to remember going to Cleveland and the river was on fire, to go to Los Angeles and not being able to see because of the haze. Now I go to Beijing and I see that I can't see when I get off the plane. We have the cleanest air in the world. We've reduced it 90%, even as the use of coal has climbed during that period of time. This is because we've made huge investments. And our utilities in the room can tell you specifically what they've invested. Over $118 billion nationally has been invested in clean air in this country. And now the EPA is moving to regulate carbon emissions from power plants. It's being done in 2 stages. First, on new source plants, and then second, on existing plants. And I want to talk about those a little bit more today. Given the impacts of the proposals, the timeline for these regulations is very, very aggressive. We've never had anything this fast before in my memory or review of regulatory history. The final rule for new power plants will be unveiled later this year. The final rule for existing power plants will be announced next June. The states will be given only 1 year to develop their plan. All the cooperative efforts that have happened in the industry up until this time have taken 2, 3, 4 years to occur. As you might imagine, these regulations are going to hurt a lot of states, because we have a huge difference in this country as to what we pay. Remember, Kentucky pays 25% below the average. In the Northeast, you may be paying 18 cents or more. Hawaii may be paying 30-some cents a kilowatt more. Kentucky pays 25% under the average. So some states are going to be hurt. And let me give you some examples about how Kentucky will be hurt. I want to start with the whole idea of the plan. EPA is proposing standards that are based on flawed and impossible assumptions. And I'm going to give you some examples of the impossibility. The rule demands that Kentucky reduce its carbon emissions from power plants by 18%. And they talk about flexibility. Well, 18%. This requires Kentucky and the assumptions to be based on the following: increasing electricity from natural gas by 100%. That means we'll have to shift from coal over to natural gas, and we're assuming that we've got the plants in place and the plants can burn at 70% rate. There are a lot of assumptions in this EPA proposal that haven't been tried out yet. We're also saying we're going to reduce consumer use of electricity by more than 10%. That's one of the building blocks in this whole plan of the EPA. Now, what's happened beyond the recession? We've had steady growth over a long period of time in this country in electricity. Think of how you use electricity today. Think of how many smartphones and iPhones and computers that you have. Do you really believe that we're going to be able to go down 10%? I had a manufacturer from Kentucky come to me recently and say, we're not going to be able to reduce the use of electricity by improving our product by 10%. Well, of course not. There's a rebound effect in any kind of manufacturing that does not allow that. But that's one of the base assumptions, and that's why I think it's flawed. We also say that increasing electricity from renewable energy sources must be increased by 400% in Kentucky. I think it's 700% in West Virginia. Of course, renewables should be part of our energy mix. I'm truly an all-of-the-above person. When I was on the TVA board, I voted for nuclear, for wind, for solar, for coal, for gas. I truly believe that in my personal life. I don't think that we should be held hostage to any one energy source. But renewable sources like solar and wind are not capable of serving as a base load of electricity. Believing that Kentucky can increase its renewables by 400% is fantasy and not reality. It's a fantasy. Well, Kentucky would be hurt because of a lower demand for Kentucky coal. Over 60% of the coal produced in Kentucky is used by power plants in other states. The EPA acknowledges that under its proposal, generation from coal will decline by nearly 30% nationwide. And they estimate that coal prices will decline by about 18%. Well, that has effects on taxes in Kentucky, jobs in Kentucky. Obviously, it's going to hurt Kentucky mining. And we're already at the lowest production level since 1963, if you think back to the other chart that was on the screen. Well, finally, the EPA proposal would hurt Kentucky's overall economy. We modeled what we believed that the EPA proposal was going to be last year, and based on that model, the electric prices in Kentucky would increase by about 40%. As outlined earlier, this would hurt the manufacturers, our most vulnerable citizens, and the competitiveness of the state. But the EPA proposal would hurt more than just Kentucky. While its impacts are still being studied, there are a few things that we can say for certain about this 1,400-page regulation that's under comment right now. And I guess this is a central point of what I'm going to say today. I get a lot of questions about climate change, and I'm sure that you may have some questions on that. The proposal that the EPA has put out would make no difference in addressing concerns of climate change. Let me say that again. The proposal that the EPA has put out would make no difference in addressing concerns about climate change. Even if we closed our entire fleet of coal plants in this country, global emissions of greenhouse gases would be reduced by just 3%. Increases in average global temperatures would be reduced by 3/100th of a degree Celsius. And increases in sea level would be reduced by less than the thickness of 1 penny. Now, these are based on all government assumptions that we went back and took government numbers to come to this conclusion. The EPA knows this too, and that's why the EPA Administrator, Gina McCarthy, told Congress recently that, quote, it's unlikely that any specific one step is going to be seen as having a visible impact on global climate change. We're doing all this for the thickness of a penny. The regulations are not about setting an example. The regulations are about leadership and a legacy. But what leadership? Who's following? Not Asia, not Europe. In fact, the International Energy Agency predicts that global consumption of coal will increase by about 2.3% over the next 5 years, with China accounting for 60% of that increase. If you've been to China, you know what's going on there. In Europe, coal is selling at the lowest rate in 5 years, leading many countries to build new coal plants, Germany, other places. Recent tension in Russia, a major source of Europe's gas supply, could lead to an even greater dependence on coal. And you probably saw the deal that the Russians made with the Chinese to build the world's largest coal plant, and they're also going to be shipping all their gas supply there. We certainly haven't boxed the Russians in with foreign policy. Earlier this year, a commissioner of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, testified before Congress that the events of last winter showed him that our power system is in a, quote, more precarious situation than he thought. Now, these are government words. Nothing I say today could gloss over the challenges we face, but the news is not all bad, and these challenges aren't insurmountable. I guess that's the hope. It's still in our hands. What Kentucky and other states need to do over the next few years is to assert our own rights to regulate carbon emissions from power plants. You all know the 10th Amendment to the Constitution is clear that any power not given to the federal government belongs to the state. The federal government, in particular the EPA, was never given the authority that they're taking today. To help establish Kentucky's authority, I'm proposing that we look at doing 4 things. First, we've got to educate ourselves on the issue and how it impacts us. Discontinuing the use of coal would hurt more than the mining industry. It's going to be a devastating blow to small businesses and particularly manufacturers. That's why you saw the governor of Indiana take such a hard statement on this last week. They have the largest manufacturing base in the country there. If you're not sure how coal benefits your business or how these regulations might hurt, we have a handout today. It's a 2-page handout. If you get a chance to look at that. I'd also encourage you to look at our website, www.americaspower.org, how you can get involved. We need you to be vocal. If these proposals would hurt your business, your job, your family, your community, then we need your voice in this debate. Think what it would happen to you. Would you feel the pain if your electricity prices went up 40% in Kentucky? The EPA is now accepting comments about the proposed regulations of existing power plants. If you're interested in making a comment, you can do it through our organization. We have a website that helps you do that easily. It's www.keepamericas, with an S, poweron.org, www.keepamericaspoweron.org. Beyond that, talking to people, your friends, customers, colleagues. Kentucky must be clear about the harm these regulations are doing and make sure that people know about them. Well, third, as a state, Kentucky, and hopefully many other states, will stand up and challenge the EPA's proposed regulations and their authority to do it, legislatively, administratively, and if necessary, through the courts. The Kentucky legislature took a critical step in passing HB 388 last year, and I thank the Chamber for their support on that. I want to thank our leaders in the House and the Senate and the governor for signing this legislation. This is a first step for Kentucky saying, this is a problem, this is an overreach. Keep this within the fence if there's going to be anything at all. Kentucky is not alone in being proactive. In the past year, 19 other states have taken some type of legislative actions to protect their own coal fleets. And now we're starting to hear from some of the western states and the northeastern states saying, wait a minute, we're having to reduce ours by 40% and Kentucky's only by 17%, and this is not fair on us. We're also hearing from members of the public regulatory commissions that Washington's taking over our job. The EPA now is not just doing EPA work, they're doing the work of the Department of Energy, and they're going to be doing the work of regulatory agencies in the state. Is this what the Constitution wanted? Is this what Congress intended? The law we passed in Kentucky rightfully asserts our authority to develop an implementation plan that makes sense for our state, a plan that takes economic concerns and reliability concerns into account. After our state implementation plan, or SIP, is completed, we must prepare to defend it in the face of EPA criticism. They will demand emission levels that support President Obama's climate change agenda, even if such levels are impractical or impossible for Kentucky. Some will say that we can't stand up to the EPA, and I hear this sometimes from people involved in the bureaucracy, well-meaning state workers or even federal workers who think we've just got to solve this problem. They'll say that we can't protect our industry in Kentucky with affordable electricity. They'll say if we don't play ball with the EPA, Kentucky will be subject to a FIP, and that will give EPA control over our electricity system. But there's too much at stake. There's too much at stake for us. As it's a competitive advantage for Kentucky, and we can't allow EPA to continue expanding its control over energy in this country. Down the road, this fight will almost certainly end in court. And when it does, I'm confident that we're going to prevail. Now, as a recovering attorney, a graduate of the University of Kentucky Law School, very proudly, but someone who doesn't practice on a daily basis, I don't try to predict what courts are going to say. But in this instance, I want to point some things out to you. In a ruling just a few weeks ago, the Supreme Court expressed concern about EPA overreaching its authority. The case didn't impact on the power plant rule, but it did provide insight on how the Supreme Court might respond to the overreach. For those of you lawyers that would like to look at this one, it's Utility Air Regulatory Group, UARG, versus EPA. And the Supreme Court said, quote, an agency, EPA, has no power to tailor legislation to bureaucratic policy goals by rewriting unambiguous statutory terms. That used to be the basic administrative law when I was in law school about 40 years ago. In the same opinion, the court added stern language. EPA's interpretation is unreasonable because it would bring about an enormous and transformative expansion in EPA's regulatory authority without clear congressional authorization. Well, I'm convinced that if Kentucky and other states hold firm through our legislative actions, administrative actions, and legal actions, that we're going to prevail. And I think you see why with this quote. Finally, we've got to hold our public officials accountable and ask them to do everything in their power to defeat the regulations and support coal. We need leaders in Washington and in Frankfurt who will represent the interest of Kentucky and not the interest of the EPA, not to go along to get along. Fortunately, we have many great officials who are doing just that, working to defeat these proposals. During the midterm elections this year and during our statewide elections next year, we must ask our candidates for their plan to stand up to the EPA. And conveniently, we're going to have that opportunity this afternoon with several of the candidates for governor. Well, the task before us is very large, but you can see that I'm optimistic about this. And I'm optimistic for one reason. The world, America, Kentucky, you need coal. It has been and will continue to be a major source of electricity, which is important to us. In his State of the Union address this year, the President paid tribute to Americans whose ordinary days help make America extraordinary. He talked about teachers, entrepreneurs, auto workers, farmers, parents, and others. And we honor those Americans, but as we do, we must also reflect on the actions that government is taking to help or hurt these everyday Americans. Today in America, and today in Kentucky, a farmer woke up early and used electric lights to guide his path. Today in America, and today in Kentucky, a teacher plugged in a computer to help inspire a student. Today in America, today in Kentucky, an entrepreneur turned on a sign that said, "Open for business." These people help our country in many different ways, but they're united in the need for affordable and reliable electricity, something we can best provide. The generations before us used coal to help make a better world. Now it's our responsibility to ensure that coal can still be there for future generations. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been a pleasure to be before you this morning. I look forward to your questions.
Anyone want to come up to the mics? There's one. Heather.
Hi, how are you? Heather Warman. I'm the Executive Director for the Kentucky Environmental Foundation.
Which foundation, I'm sorry?
The Kentucky Environmental Foundation. So you mentioned earlier some interesting things about rivers being on fire and going to China and not being able to see. Children in China right now are getting lung cancer at the age of 12. China has made last year the #1 investment in clean energy. In 2013, they invested $542 billion towards clean energy, in large part directly correlated to the health effects that they are suffering from fossil fuel production. So the EPA, in large part, is exactly responsible for cleaning up the air over the last 30 and 40 years. And in Kentucky, coal is very important, and we need to include it in our energy mix. But when it's 93% of our energy mix, and our health is ranked 49th in the United States of America, I fail to see how the EPA's regulations are going to harm our state as we move forward. And we could also increase renewable energy jobs in eastern Kentucky and give back work to people that don't have work because the coal is gone. It's not that there's coal there that could be mined. The coal's been taken. And once the communities are cleaned up of the coal industry moves out, and then there's no jobs left for the people that are there because there is no coal. Those communities need other viable sources of income. Renewable energy could bring that to them in forms of solar, in forms of geothermal, and lots of other investments. Energy efficiency could provide a lot of jobs for our state. So I'm just curious, as I'm listening to you talk about the EPA regulations, why we don't ever talk about the fact that the Environmental Protection Agency was created to protect our health. And that's where all of these regulations are stemming from. And increasing our health and making it better in the state of Kentucky will increase our economic development at the same time. Do you not feel that way about the regulations at all?
I'm sorry, I've been listening carefully to you. You made a couple notes. Can you focus your question for me?
Yeah, I guess my main question is for the industry. I don't see that the coal industry is investing in clean coal technology at all. The federal government's subsidizing it. The state is subsidizing it. The utilities are subsidizing it. So coal doesn't seem to invest in cleaning up the technology themselves. And in addition, the health issues never ever talked about when we talk about coal in the state of Kentucky. So
Well,
the regulations
let me-
would increase health.
So you want to talk about health? Is that?
I do. I want to talk about
You're all
the
over the
health.
board, so if you'll focus for me, I'll try to answer your question.
Okay, great. So my question is, do you feel that the EPA regulations have anything to do with the health of our state?
I supported the beginning of the EPA. President Nixon started the EPA. I was part of the first Earth Day program in Lexington and also at Midway College when I was in college. And I think we have made progress with the EPA. I think the EPA is out of control. I think the EPA does not take economic considerations into account, and they need to take those into consideration. I don't think we would have the health care system in Kentucky. We would enjoy the standard of living in this country that we do without having had coal. I think there's a social benefit to carbon, and I think we've experienced that in the agricultural community. And I have yet to see a study that directly says that CO2 causes the health problems that's alluded to but never specifically used. And usually the health problems is put out as an argument when you're losing the economic argument.
Are there other questions?
I can ask.
This one, I'm from Owensboro, and the aluminum industry saved Owensboro after GE's demise back when I was a kid. And the aluminum industry came into Hancock County. It's in Logan County, now in Bowling Green. Where do you see the most vulnerability in Kentucky's manufacturing mix as far as the electrical rates?
Well, it has to do with companies that are highly intensive users of electricity, and that typically will be companies that do steel manufacturing, or they'll do sheet manufacturing. Those are the companies that it makes a huge difference. For example, Alcoa Aluminum, when I was on the TVA board, that was a big issue for us with Alcoa. Alcoa was able to take one of their plants to Iceland because the people in Iceland wanted the plant, and they subsidized the electricity for them, and they paid higher rates individually than what they were charging the utility there. So those are the manufacturers that are most vulnerable in Kentucky, and that's automaking in Kentucky.
Other questions? Anyone?
I have another question if no one else has any.
Hey, Heather,
I'm sure he will.
But are there any other questions before we break for lunch? Here's one back
Great,
here.
great.
Hey, Mike. Ben with the U.S. Chamber, and thanks for all you do. Question on competitiveness, kind of, I think, following up. I didn't hear Dave's, but I think you said 25% less or cheaper energy than in Kentucky than national average. Have you guys done any studies on, if the EPA regs, when the proposed regs went into effect, how would that change Kentucky's mix and cost, and how would that affect Kentucky's competitiveness? I assume that's a plus on the site selection magazines and things like that when people are looking to expand businesses.
It is, and we're in the process of doing that study now. We've gone back to NERA, which is a third-party recognized national association, and we've asked them to take the specific EPA proposal and model it for us and have it ready so that we can enter it into the record, building our legal case. We're going to enter that into the record before the administrative time elapses that we can make those. So I don't have the answers today, but what we did the last time was take the National Legal Defense Fund's plan, which is basically, according to the New York Times, what the EPA has adopted, and it showed about a 40% increase for Kentucky. Now, what also happens during that, there are winners and losers, because EPA would really like for this to be a national cap and trade. You recall the president put that forward. The Congress rejected that, I think correctly, because of economic and other concerns. And this encourages states to band together, gives you more time if you band together, and that would be the intent ultimately, is to try to have that national cap and trade. What's wrong with national cap and trade for Kentucky? Well, Kentucky has a huge advantage over California when it comes to manufacturing because of our electricity rates here. We have an advantage over the Northeast. So I don't have a specific number for you yet. We will have regional numbers. It's awfully hard to model a specific state, particularly Kentucky, because think of how much outflow and inflow we have with our borders, the Cincinnati area, the Ashland area, the Paducah area. But we'll have a regional number that we'll be able to provide the Chamber of Commerce on that.
Let me characterize a couple of different viewpoints on these EPA regulations, and Chad's back there. He'll be my fact checker. He's our energy guy on staff. Let me characterize a couple of different perspectives on the EPA and then ask Mike to react to this. Secretary Peters of the state's energy cabinet has developed a white paper and floated it to the EPA, basically calling for maximum flexibility between the states in order for a state like Kentucky that's very coal dependent not to be overly penalized, whereas California is very auto dependent, and we ought to get, some flexibility. So from what I understand, the president's plan provides some of that. On the other hand, there are folks who say, no, we're going to stop this, let's sue them, let's take them to court, we'll drag this out. White House might change in 2016, Congress might change in November, and don't ever say die, we're going to fight this thing. Where do you see all that coming out? Or is that a fair characterization?
Well, I wish the Secretary were here. We've met with him and talked about this at different times. I think if we talked about the new source performance standards, he would tell you that we're more in alignment on that because it's keeping us from building new coal plants in Kentucky, which is the future of Kentucky down the road. So I won't speak for him, but I will say that in law school we learned that you could argue in the alternative, that you could say X, but if not X, then Y. However, in administrative law, sometimes you lose standing when you do that. And so I believe that it's more important for us to maintain our standing because coal is so important to Kentucky and West Virginia and some other states that we could name, that we need to be in the forefront of that. So I take a different policy view. I understand this desire to want to work with the EPA and to make it work and to think that you can shape the regulations, but really the flexibility was not flexibility. They say that the base year was 2005 and the base year was really 2012. And as the states dig into this, they're finding they have less flexibility because they all have these targets they have to meet. They have to reduce consumer use of electricity and business use of electricity by 10%. They have to have renewables go up by 400% in Kentucky, other percentages in other states. So the 4 pillars that are built into the EPA plan actually take flexibility away from the state. So I think I have a little policy disagreement with the Secretary. I think the Secretary correctly understands that, you know, Kentucky has had a loss in coal-generated power plants recently. I think he also understands that we need to have a future. And what I saw happen yesterday with the LG&E plant, the announcement about I think it's a 2-megawatt plant that's going to have carbon capture, is a great thing for Kentucky. So I'm supportive of that.
Okay, very good. We've got a few minutes before lunch. We got a great speaker at lunch, Rob Samuels from Makers. And you might want a few minutes to get your bags if you haven't gotten out of your room. I will say about Mike Duncan, you know, there are a lot of communities represented in this room here, some more than others. I'm sure a lot of folks from Louisville in here. But I would venture to say that Inez is the best represented community. There are at least 2 people here. Is Craig's here? Yeah, 3, 4. Oh, per capita, Inez is the most represented with Mike Duncan and Jim Booth and the others. So glad to have the Inez Mafia here. Do you have one more question? Do you have time?
I had a quick question.
Yeah, okay, one more.
I think it was last week that Australia repealed their
Yes.
carbon emission tax, and South Korea delayed their implementation of their cap-and-trade plan. Are those, do you know if those are, can you speak to those at all, if they're based
I can. I left out part of my speech today. I could get into the international. But basically, we produce about a billion tons of coal here a year. There's about 8.5 billion tons produced on an international basis a year. And other countries have tried different things. Australia tried the cap and trade. And not only it hurt them from an economic standpoint, but it potentially is going to hurt them from a reliability standpoint. I didn't get into the real reliability thing today and talk about the polar vortex and try to create that whole genre. But it's true that last year, when we look at reliability, that had the power plants that we run in Kentucky and AEP runs in their system not been there, they couldn't have met the demand. They were using 89% of the capacity of the plants that they're going to be closing. Southern Company, big producer in the South, was using 75%. So I'm very concerned about reliability as well as affordability. And these are also issues that we see from other countries, that reliability starts to become a problem. You've got to have a certain reserve to keep that going. And as you bring that reserve down, you put yourself in a situation where you can have these rolling brownouts and blackouts. I'd be happy to talk to you individually about this.
All right, have a break, and we'll upstairs for lunch at promptly at 12.
Dave, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your